Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we focus on a recent book by Jefferson Cowie, Freedom's Dominion, a saga of white resistance to federal power, published by Basic Books in late November. Our discussants this afternoon are Mia Bay of the University of Pennsylvania and Alex Lichtenstein of Indiana University. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Woodrow Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. For over the past decade, the seminar has been meeting weekly in pre-COVID times, in person at the Wilson Center, and since that pandemic thing, and now that we're in the post-pandemic era, apparently here in the virtual realm. A few FYIs before we get going. First, please take note of two sessions coming up of the seminar. The first is actually tomorrow, Tuesday, May 2nd, and featured Natalia Telpaneva's Cold War Liberation, the Soviet Union, and the Collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa. And next week, we reconvene on our usual Monday, that's May 8th, for a session on Georgetown University's Joseph Sassoon's new book, The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of Empire. Second, today's session is sponsored by the American Historical Association. Third, we'd like to thank Pete Bierstecker of Wilson Center, Rachel Wheatley of the AHA. These are the two behind-the-scenes folks whose efforts make these seminars possible. And on the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on our institution's respective websites. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom, and we'll call on as many folks as we can. And with those preliminaries out of the way, we can get the seminar fully underway. Jefferson Cowie, a social and political historian, is the James G. Stallman Professor of History at Vanderbilt University. He's the author of 4 books, including Capital Moves, RCA's 70-Year Quest for Cheap Labor, Staying Alive, the 1970s and the Last Days of the Working Class, which won the 2011 Francis Parkman Prize and that year's Merle Curdy Prize, and The Great Exception, The New Deal, and the Limits of American Politics. His reviews, his essays, his opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Chronicle of Higher Education, the American Prospect, the New Republic, the Chicago Tribune, and other popular outlets. And today, we're delighted to have him, and when he speaks on his latest book, Freedom's Dominion, a saga of white resistance to federal power. Jeff, welcome to the Washington History Seminar. The screen's all yours.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for having me, everybody. And it's an honor to be among such talent people I've looked to in a variety of ways in the actual creation of this book. So I'm very honored to be here, and thank you for everybody behind the scenes who makes such events happen. As usual, we honor the hidden labor on these things. So my task is to sketch out some key elements of the book in 10 or 15 minutes so we can get to some discussions, which I've actually enjoyed much more than hearing myself talk about this book. And I'm anxious to hear what others may have to say. So the argument or the tension of this project is sort of in the title, Freedom's Dominion, that freedom is a question of power and space. And that is sort of the opening framing that I'm using for understanding this. And when I think about freedom, I really struggled. The impetus behind this project was to try and get at this American creed, to try and figure out what it is we're talking about. And of course, we're talking about all sorts of different things when we invoke freedom, and much has been written on freedom. But the first thing I did was reject most of the theoretical work on freedom and look at much more of the social history of freedom. And what I ended up choosing was Orlando Patterson's Freedom in the Making of the Western Mind. And what I like about Patterson's construct about freedom is that he gets beyond the Isaiah Berlin sort of negative and positive liberty construct and gives us sort of a 3-part construct for thinking about freedom. One we're all familiar with, that's individual liberty, the Bill of Rights. This is the sort of stuff we all celebrate. The second element of freedom that he looks at is civic freedom. That is the capacity for a group of people to participate in their making of their political community. Something we tend to overlook, I think, but important nonetheless. And the third element, he uses the very clunky word sovereignal or sovereignal freedom. And by this, he means something I think very overlooked and very compelling, especially in the American experience as it plays out in the sort of settler colonial and chattel slave societies. And that is the freedom to dominate, the freedom to oppress, the freedom to control, freedom as an expression and an ideology of power. And this is what I glommed onto. And when in this book, in trying to understand how freedom works, and I actually looked. What's most fascinating to me as I looked at this one place that I'll talk about in a minute, is I saw the first two elements of freedom, individual liberty and political capacity, often mobilized on behalf of the third one, this freedom to dominate or freedom to oppress. So that's the sort of opening definition of freedom that I'm using. And then in terms of the dominion question, I'm placing this idea in what James Madison called the compound republic. And that's a phrase I like better than federalism, because federalism is almost as confusing as the word liberalism. So I prefer compound republic. And that is that we have a political structure that moves from the local to the state to the federal and back down again. And that there's an inherent tension in this political structure. And we study elite politics, we study state politics, we study local politics, but we don't often enough sort of follow the chain of power relationships up and down the sort of compound republic. So I wanted to do that. And what this does is kind of takes the old community study back from the old social history, and then places it in a much more sort of politically charged grid of power relationships and tensions, if you will. And then we sort of bring the state back in, of course. But then by injecting freedom into that, we're also kind of bringing in a little linguistic turn, and then embedding the whole thing in a little bit of a history of capitalism that's sort of in the background, not in the foreground. So we have this construct of freedom, and this freedom to dominate is the central theme. We're putting the politically sort of charged compound republic, as Madison called it. And now we need our place. And the place that I selected almost by accident is, well, literally by accident, is Barbour County, Alabama. And Barbour County, Alabama is down in the southeast corner of Alabama on the banks of the Chattahoochee River, right across the river from Georgia. And it's in the Black Belt. Well, actually, the Black Belt runs right through it. So it's actually the northern half is Black Belt and the southern half is not, more wiregrass. And this county, I think I could have chosen a number of places. The argument works most effectively, I think, in the Deep South, but I think it would hold for a lot of other places as well. And I went back to sort of look at this place. And I started, when I discovered Barbour County, I went back to the beginning, and I began to look at Indian removal, Andrew Jackson's policies there and things like that. It wasn't actually until later that I found out the key element to my story, which was that Governor George Wallace was from Barbour County. And so this gave me a good sort of hook for the story, but it also allowed me to deeply historicize a figure like Wallace, who was transformational in American politics, in such a way as to show that he is the product of a long, long political chain. And he, in fact, loved local history. And so it opens with, the book opens with a key story, and that is, it opens with George Wallace in 1963 giving his inaugural address when he is elected governor of the state of Alabama. And when he gives this is the very, very famous address that appears in textbooks throughout the land, where he says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. A line written by Asa Carter, a Klansman, and a bit of a huckster and a fraud. And that's his sort of line in the sand in terms of fighting to maintain segregation in the face of the civil rights movement. But if you go back and you read the speech, he does two things in that people don't talk about. One, it's a long homage to his home county. He names all these funny places in Barber County with these very colorful names. And he's really saying, this is where I come from. These are the people I represent. These are the people I'm protecting. And then he goes on to mention either freedom or liberty 24 times. He mentioned segregation one other time in that speech for a total of 4 times. And freedom or liberty almost 24 times. And I think most of us have for so long just said, oh, that's just window dressing. That's nothing we have to take seriously. He's just invoking the American creed. But in fact, I think he's invoking this freedom to dominate, this freedom as power idea that goes all the way back to the dispossession of the Muskogee Creek people of their land, and a theme that goes all the way through to the modern era. And so he is doing what generations of people have done, and that is fighting for freedom from federal power. And that's sort of what I call a racial anti-statist framework. That freedom for him is a racialized resistance to federal power. And I say racialized because what he does is something sort of clever politically. I think he's actually a bit of a political genius, evil genius. And that is, by making the enemy federal authority, which is the enemy throughout this book of white people in Barber County. By making federal power the enemy, he allows for a bigger tent. He's going to get the racists. He's going to get the diehard racists. But by making the federal authority the enemy, he's going to get a much bigger tent. Everybody's got a beef with federal power, and taxpayers do, and housing people do. People who want to maintain their neighborhoods the way they are, and other things. And it's a message that he knows will resonate in the North. And he's already in 1963 looking to go national. So that's the opening. 3 things: the definition of liberty, the nature of the compound republic, and this place, Barber County, that is so central to, or that is central to how the sort of all the characters, all the people, and all the places. And the story I tell is one of white people resisting the incursion of federal authority when it does not work in their favor in the name of freedom. And the book is divided into 4 parts. And those 4 parts, the first one is the dispossession of the Muskogee Creek people. And this is as historians, a hard thing to wrap our heads around. It took me a long time, because what happened, Jackson, there's a 9-county area along the Chattahoochee, and Barber County is the southernmost county in this, that is set aside by a treaty in 1832 to be for the Creek people. And they're gonna set up a privatized land scheme. But what Jackson does is kind of the unthinkable. He betrays his own white settlers by protecting the treaty rights of the Muskogee Creek people against the whites. And he sends in marshals, then troops, to remove white people from Native American lands. Now, it's all part of a long game to get Native American people west of the Mississippi. Don't get your hopes up on this. But what this does is create the pattern that will resonate throughout the next 200 years of history. And so by doing so, he rallies up. He basically launches what's known as the Intruders' War, in which white intruders fight federal power, specifically Jackson, who is the white guy's hero, right? The guy who liberated all of the Southeast from the Native Americans for the yeoman settlers. And so this idea of freedom as the freedom to dominate, the freedom to move into other people's lands, to take it over, and then fight federal authority as it comes in to try to mess with it, launches the sort of central theme of the book. And that it ends up going awry. And by 1836, there's a huge war and the federal government comes in on side of the whites. But the federal government is there long enough, in fact, burns down key buildings built by white people in the main town of Eufaula to get rid of them. You know, so the die is sort of cast here, in which white people are set up to hate the federal government because it is creating friction between them and their freedom to dominate the lands that they've been promised, at least ideologically, if not by treaty rights. That's the first part. The second part of the book moves on to the Civil War, but especially Reconstruction. And this is where the centrality, I think, of federal force is well known in American history, where federal power comes in on the side of loosely, complexly, corruptly, messily, on the side of freedmen after the Civil War. And a sort of biracial democracy is set up in Barber County at federal bayonet point. And the same thing that went on during the Intruders' War. And this is a flourishing of a rough democratic system at the time. But a black congressman is sent to Washington, black representatives are sent to Montgomery. There's a scalawag is the main judge. And then the white people tried all sorts of shenanigans until 1874, where they finally give up any kind of tricks to try to get rid of federal power, and they just shoot black voters in the streets of Barber County, especially Eufaula and Spring Hill, these two towns. And they seize power in a violent coup. They just seize it. This is known as the Eufaula riot. Of course, it was not a riot. It was a white seizure of power against a biracial democracy. But they do this in the name of freedom from federal tyranny. In fact, they secede from the Union because they will stand up as free men and not be slaves to federal authority. And so the same pattern exists. After 1874, most of the black Republican activists flee the county for their lives. And essentially you have the quote unquote redemption of white rule in Barber County. And then that brings us up to the third section of the book, which is I call federal power and repose, federal power and retreat. This is kind of what happens in the absence of federal power. And as I mentioned in the book, federal authority is sort of this clay-footed, weak-kneed hero in this book. It never quite delivers the goods, but it's the one hope. Native Americans are pleading to Jackson to bring in more troops. Freedmen, after the Civil War, pleading for more federal representation. Here we have a period where there is none, where the federal government is pulled out. And we see the most heinous aspects, I think, of American racial relations other than slavery emerge: convict leasing, lynching. I'm probably alone in the world with a chapter called Lynching is an Act of Freedom. And the establishment of the segregationist Constitution in 1901, which I call Jeffersonian democracy, or white oligarchy as Jeffersonian democracy, right? This idea that by using Jeffersonian individualist anti-statist rhetoric, a small clique of people can rule the show. And then this goes through also the New Deal era, and I have a whole argument about paternalism at the local textile mills, and then the governor who has to deal with the Federal Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC, and a story many of you know. The final and fourth section is about the rise of modern civil rights and the rise of George Wallace at the same time. And Wallace is fascinating because he, as many of you know, he begins as a bit more of a populist. He wants to build roads and trade schools and kind of do the right thing. But he's mostly a political animal above all else. And after 1954, after Brown versus Board, he begins to see that playing the race card is the way forward. And he plays it very well and very manipulatively, very darkly. Actually, if I'll just give you a little quick flavor of what I'm talking about here, because when Wallace is the master of bringing up all these versions of freedom that we've seen throughout the story. And in 1967, he says, "There are those who would tell us today that freedom means something different than it meant to our fathers. But when a central government bureaucrat or judge takes from us our right to run our schools, to determine the destiny of our own children, to run our labor unions, our businesses, our hospitals, and our very lives, I do not call that freedom. I call that abject slavery to government. I call it slavery the most degenerate origin that goes back 1,000 years in time and rests its right to rule upon threat and blackmail, upon punishment of the sick and weak and helpless, and upon the savage doctrine that might is right, upon the naked, ugly power of tyranny." Right. So this is he connects arcs all the way back in a sort of rough continuity with a lot of variety all the way back. And he becomes the fighting judge because after the 1957 Civil Rights Act, he's forced to turn over local ballots to the feds, and he fights back in this sort of melodramatic way, and it ends up becoming the fighting judge that sets him up to win the gubernatorial race in 62, becomes governor in 63, and now we're back to where we began, which is the 63 inaugural address. And as you know, he went on to run for president in 64, 68, 72, 76, not so well, after being shot in 72. But you know what? The thing that really struck me about the civil rights section was less Wallace than it was looking at the civil rights struggle on the ground in a place that nobody had really written about. That there's, we all know Selma, we all know Birmingham, we all know Memphis, Atlanta, other places. But there's these unknown places all over the place, and what happened there, right? And it's a very dramatic story. But the moment that clarified everything for me was when Hosea Williams, who's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference's key lieutenant, he's Martin Luther King's key lieutenant, he's poring over all the records, trying to figure out, after the Voting Rights Act, why some counties do really well in voting rights and in registration, and other counties don't do as well. And he's like, it's not leadership. I know those leaders. It's not organizing capacity. I know the organized. He can't figure it out. And then he finally realizes that there's one variable that explains everything in terms of voter registration success or failure, and that is the presence or absence of a federal registrar in the county. Right? The exact same thing that Wallace is fighting against and Black people in Barber County are fighting for. So you have a clash of citizenship, local people wanting federal citizenship and local authorities, state and local authorities, wanting to maintain local citizenship. And for me, that was kind of the moment that clarified it all. And I should probably wrap it up there. But I try to take the story forward in very brief and almost schematic terms all the way up to the attempted seizure of the Capitol building on January 6th. So happy to talk more details about any aspect of that as people would like, but I want to hear what other people have to say.
Jeff, thank you very, very much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Mia Bay, the Roy F. and Jeanette P. Nichols Chair of American History at the University of Pennsylvania. A scholar of American and African American intellectual, cultural, and social history, she is the author of The White Image in the Black Mind, African American Ideas About White People, 1830 to 1925, published by Oxford in 2000, To Tell the Truth Freely, The Life of Ida B. Wells, published by Farrar Straus in 2009, and the edited work, Ida B. Wells, The Light of Truth, The Writings of an Anti-Lynching Crusader, published by Penguin in 2014. She's also the co-author of the textbook Freedom on My Mind, The History of African Americans with Documents, and the editor of 2 other collections. Her latest book, Traveling Black, A Story of Race and Resistance, published by Harvard in 2021, won the Bancroft Prize, the Lillian Smith Book Prize, amongst others. That book was the subject of a Washington History Seminar last May. Mia, welcome back to the seminar.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Jeff, for outlining the book. I appreciate being here. I'm excited to talk about this book. Jeff, this is the first time I've read the final version, which was very exciting. And one of the things I would add to your summary of the book for those who haven't read it is that, you know, in sort of grounding your story in one particular place, you produce a really amazing narrative and sort of way of thinking about your story. So kudos to you for that. I guess what I want to talk about in my comment is this sort of how the compelling history of a place that you tell raises really unsettling questions about freedom, about the meaning of freedom in both the history of the United States and modern day politics. We tend to be kind of sentimentally positive about freedom in the United States. We have many textbooks, you know, Give Us Liberty, The Story of American Freedom. The African American history textbooks are usually a little more plaintive, like I hope for freedom, freedom on my mind. But you are suggesting that that freedom in many ways is as effectively deployed by white freedom fighters as it is in, let's say, the Black freedom struggle, in the struggles of women and other and minority groups, and this sort of sovereign freedom is a very powerful strain in American history. The connection that you make between that freedom and the sort of ancient world origins of political ideas about freedom, I think, is a powerful one, and sort of suggests in powerful ways that as you note, freedom and slavery are sort of Janus face. To even fully imagine what freedom is, you have to sort of imagine the freedom from the side of the master as well as the slave. But it's challenging to wrap one's mind around that, especially with regard to your sort of your chronological starting point, which is, of course, the Creek story, which seems to sometimes be maybe part of a different story about settler colonialism, in which part of what is sort of intended with the Indians is ultimately a removal and eradication that requires federal power. At the same time, federal power is being opposed and is sort of suggests that there's different ways in which this works for different groups. So that's one thing I would ask you to comment on moving forward. And I have a sort of a list of other questions I'd like to get to. So let me just start with, let me just list those before I hear back from you. Much of the history in the book is, of course, not new, but I think the frame of reference in which she put it is provocative and interesting. Like I said, a departure from the work of historians who emphasize freedom as a positive, if not fully realized theme in American history. And I think it kind of offers interesting challenges to the work of his sort of contemporary historical debates about, let's say, the founding and sort of where where America's original sin is, and also the role of racial capitalism. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I kind of feel like your emphasis on the economic is not on the same level as some scholars who would sort of say racial capitalism is perhaps the original sin here as opposed to slavery. So those are things I'd also like to push you on. And I guess another thing, just to go quickly back to the ancient ideas, is why is this sort of slavery freedom thing so powerful still, even long after the demise of slavery? Why would ideas that have such a sort of lineage remain so important? One answer that comes to mind, of course, is the centrality of ideas about race, which is sort of key to notions of freedom mobilized by leaders such as Wallace. You emphasize that one of Wallace's most important innovations in his sort of political career is the way in which he abandons an emphasis on segregation in favor of complaints about federal overreach. In his political career. In doing so, you suggest he laid the groundwork for a new right-wing coalition that could be built around politics, exploit racial politics, as a path to less government and more white freedom, a northern strategy that is with us to that day. I guess one question I have about that strategy is it meaningful without racial animus and or the kind of structural racism it cloaks? Can it survive modern day demographic shifts that shrink the white majority, or is it potentially limited? I also had questions about the sincerity of the anti-statism that runs through your book. You identified as central to Barber County's long white freedom struggle and American conservative politics more generally. But it seems sometimes that white Americans reject federal power in a very selective fashion. I mentioned with reference to the Indians, where there's uprisings against the federal troopers when they protect the Creek, but when they come to remove them and eradicate them, there's no longer any uprisings. And you see that again with things like the New Deal, in which sort of deals are made in which the federal overreach of the New Deal becomes acceptable as long as certain concessions are made to preserve the South's labor system. And we see it to this day. I mean, we're at a moment where the right is mobilizing federal power to a degree perhaps that we've never seen before, the packing of the courts, the calls for federal bans on abortion. How intellectually coherent, consistent, and sincere are these claims of federal overreach, or are they just a sort of useful way to go? One thing they do remind me of, one of the ways in which they do seem like the sort of the other side of freedom, is that they're very capacious claims. Freedom can be used in a lot of ways, and so can claims of federal overreach. So I wonder if that's sort of where we're talking about. Another almost nearly final question I would have is, I did want to ask you with reference to that, just sort of spinning future horrible scenarios. But George Wallace's modern day heirs, would they welcome an authoritarian federal government so long as it was controlled by a white-minded elite, which sometimes seems where we're heading? And then beyond that, to the brighter side of it all, I wonder whether in focusing on freedom's dominion, we perhaps lose some sense of the potential liberatory power that freedom has for those people who deploy it. I mean, they may get inconsistent assistance from the federal government. They may not be able to sustain their gains. Is there is freedom an ideology that has some kind of potential at least to counterbalance or defeat its more sinister side? Do we see any kind of sign of that in the long history of both the Black and white freedom struggles? I would say Alabama is not necessarily a good case study for success in that story, although I do really appreciate your account of the dogged civil rights work done by Alabama citizens such as Fred Gray. But is Alabama a microcosm for the nation as a whole? You mentioned at your sort of introduction, you mentioned about space, but I wonder about place in your study. Both Alabama and Mississippi are incredibly sort of unique states in terms of the sort of horrifying stories that they tell. And they're also unique in the sort of misery they inflict on their white populations. So I just wonder whether you can also address the degree to which Alabama might be different than other places.
Mia, thank you very much. Jeff, thoughts, responses, reflections?
Yeah, I have 10 questions. I boiled that down to. So thank you for that. Very challenging battery of issues. I fear Alex is going to have nothing to say after we're done with these.
Well, very similar. Mia and I definitely read the same book. So,
and she took some of mine as well. So thanks.
Well, maybe so, Alex. Maybe if I answer these, you'll have further clarifying questions. Should we do that? What do you think? Is that the way to go? Okay. Let me start with the last couple, because I think they're connected. One is the liberatory power of freedom. Is it lost or diminished? And the nature of place being unique. And it is a story of place, absolutely. What I meant by space was the compound republic being a sort of struggle over spatial dynamics, but this is definitely a story of place, right? And that's what I wanted it to be. In fact, I probably constrained myself too much. It was very much a narrative challenge to stay inside my box of this one county. So let's start with the last one. What do we learn by a unique place where in a black belt place where this is about some of the most valuable land in the world, in which enslaved people are marched across the country in coffles and to work in the wilderness to make cotton for the world economy, and that the legacy of this is particularly brutal even after the golden era of cotton capitalism, right? I think it is. I think it's its most virulent form. I think that's what sort of makes the story in a way work. It's almost it's very vivid in that regard. But that's where I think the dimensions of the story are national. They're regional for sure, and I think they're actually national. I think they're regional. You only have to think about everything from the Civil War to the Dixiecrat Revolt, which actually Wallace did not participate in, all the way up to the present day nature of Southern politics. But the scales fell from George Wallace's eyes when he went to Serb Hall in Milwaukee, and he gave the same speech he'd always been giving, and they're giving him endless standing ovations. These white ethnic machinists and metalworkers and brewers and whatever else was in there, and he sort of realized that this kind of racialized anti-statism had connections that transcended the South. And he says that in his 63 inaugural. He basically lays out a national vision. By 68, he's saying being Southern isn't geographic, it's a state of mind, right? And that's the Northern strategy, is to project that out into the rest of the country. And I think a lot of it, it's more successful maybe than we would like it to be. In fact, the missing piece in the story is actually the Great Migrations. I would have started to do this whole analysis of trying to trace specific people and where they went up north from Barber County and what happened. That would have been like, really interesting, both whites and blacks. But anyway, I do think it's different, but I think especially the model that Wallace created, which was fail forward, right? Fight the man, fight federal power, fail every time, and fall forward, right? Because by failing, he proved his case that the federal power was wrong and evil and the rest. But then that raises the question about, okay, and this is another one on the list somewhere, is the genuineness of this, the I'm trying to remember what the word you used was, the sort of authenticity, sincerity, that's the word you use, sincerity of this. And I think this is a fascinating kind of question, because it is highly selective. And here we have to understand that there's a key element to this that I think I should have written up a little bigger, because a lot of people have asked similar questions. And that is, the federal government, the vast majority of times, and the vast majority of circumstances, and the vast majority of places, worked on the side of white people. Full stop. That's the end of that story. When it didn't, it really pissed off white people. And that's kind of the story I'm telling. Like, right, this is the thing that serves us. Government authority is for us. It's not like this racialized anti-statism that goes as freedom is enduring, inherent, no matter what. No, it happens when the federal authority comes in and does something antithetical to the values of white people, the interests of white people. So I guess that was so obvious to me. I don't think I played it up enough, but that's honestly how I think it works. So Jackson is the ultimate example. He was supposed to be the white man's hero. He betrayed them in this moment. Which leads me to your very first question, which is the Creek story sort of different than the black-white story? And again, you brought in federal power with that question too. And Creek removal requires federal power. Slavery requires federal power. The Constitution, the slavery requires Constitution. It's all there, right? That's what federal authority is doing, except when it's not, right? And then that's the clay-footed hero part, where they come in and do something good for non-white people, and they pay a hell of a price, right? This full-scale fight in some way. I think. So federal power is mostly a kind of thing that works for white people, except when it's not. And then you get this almost melodramatic, histrionic response. There's a couple of phrases. You mentioned racial capitalism. There's a few phrases I did not use in this book. I did not use the phrase racialized capital or racial capitalism. I did not whiteness may have crept in once or twice, but I tried not to use whiteness. And I only used white supremacy for a very specific time when it was used by the actors on the ground. So those are phrases. Those are historical kinds of or historians or social scientists kinds of frameworks that I didn't want to necessarily impose. But I wanted to emerge naturally from the stories. They used freedom. They used liberty all the time. So I'm not like imposing that. But those terms, they're there, they work there. I say that, this is cotton capitalism explodes in the 1840s and 1850s, and becomes less relevant in the post-war scenario. But I would like to think that it's there, even if I don't have this sort of clunky, what I regard as sort of clunky language that doesn't that sort of doesn't mesh with the richness of a local story. And you guys can challenge me on that, I'm sure. Let's see. Modern demographies. Is this meaningful for modern day stuff? I think ever the more so. The more white people are cornered, the more I think feel cornered, not actually cornered. I think the more they're going to lash out in this way, and it has nothing to do with actual kind of anti-statism in any way. And you implied this in another question. Because I think what they are, and this goes to your question about authoritarianism. Is there a space in which, under this ideology, you could seize authoritarian power? And my argument is that if fascism ever comes to America, the banner under which it marches will say freedom.
We're about to find out. We're about to make the test of this in the next few years, sadly.
Yeah, we might. I mean, I can see the Tennessee Capitol right outside my window. And we all know it's unfolded there recently. It looks like the battle days. So I think that a sort of authoritarian seizure of power under this ideology would work really well. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to sort of explore this concept in the story, is because this thread is very, it varies a lot, but I think there's a continuous arc here that delivers us to today and the dilemmas of today, and that are enduring. And that's, I think, one reason the federal government, the Federalist Society, everybody else is on the right is trying to corner the federal government ideology, but maybe use the levers as much as they can. But ideologically, I think they're really trying to limit it. And so I have more to say, but I'll turn it over to Alex so he can straighten me out on some stuff. But is the liberatory power of freedom diminished or lost by this story? It's a great question. I think it's the ultimate question about this. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think what we need to do, I think freedom is just kind of a quicksand of an idea. I'm not sure what it does anymore. Maybe, I'm too close, right? I've been for years been living this. But what I would love to see is all the energy we pour into thinking about freedom, pour it into democracy. Democracy requires sacrifice. It requires institutions. It requires participation. It requires power. It requires giving something up in exchange to be part of a civic community. Yeah, compromise. Right. Yeah. It's not just I get to do whatever I want. Everybody else be damned, which is, I think, too much of what American freedom is. I was very bothered by Joe Biden's announcement for the presidency about this sort of mushy freedom that he kept talking about. And when half the time he's actually talking about democracy or rights, which is not necessarily freedom, because they actually require other people to compromise or give up or enforce or back institutions. Okay, I'm going to stop there. There's such a good set of questions. I have 4 or 5 more I could get into, but I'm going to let poor Alex get in.
Thank you. So our second discussant this afternoon is Alex Lichtenstein, professor of history and American studies at Indiana University and the former editor-in-chief of the American Historical Review. He's the author of Twice the Work of Free Labor, a pioneering study of convict leasing in the South, and the co-author of Margaret Bourke-White and the Dawn of Apartheid, based on a photography exhibit he curated in South Africa and co-authored with Rick Halpern, published in 2016. Also, Marked and Unmarked Remembered, A Geography of American Memory, published in 2017, which was a collaboration with his brother, the photojournalist Andrew Lichtenstein. Alex is a historian of race, labor, and incarceration, amongst other things, and his essays on South African history and politics have appeared in the LA Review of Books, Johannesburg Review of Books, and most recently, Public Books. Alex, great to have you back to the seminar.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Mia, for those excellent comments that I now can repeat. Great to share a platform with you. Thank you, Jeff, for this really interesting book. And and I haven't seen it in a while, so this is really an interesting discussion so far. So my remarks will in some ways go down the same track as Mia's, but I hope will also stimulate a little more discussion and bring you back to some of these themes, Jeff, in your response. So Freedom's Dominion is a remarkable book, as Jeff did in his classic work Capital Moves, which Eric mentioned earlier. He takes a singular and focused narrative thread, in that case, the history of a single peripatetic company or industry, and in this one, the history of a small and seemingly insignificant county in Southeast Alabama, but anything but insignificant, it turns out. And he pulls at it in order to unravel a sweeping narrative tapestry with a much larger meaning. In that earlier work, Jeff showed how such a story could disclose the imperviousness to community and localism driven by the ceaseless search for ever cheaper labor that underwrote 20th century American manufacturing capitalism as it moved, for instance, from New Jersey to my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana, to Memphis, and then, of course, out to Mexico. In this book, Jeff similarly uses a longue durée, but in this case of Barbour County's history. And I'll remind you, I mean, Jeff knows this, but the population of Barbour County peaked in 1890 at 35,000 people. All right, so this is a small place. Jeff holds up a mirror to the idea of American freedom as embodied in the right to dominate others, a right claimed by white people in the language of states' rights and unbridled hostility to the federal government, usually, right? And this is, I'm going to get back to that point just as Mia did. No doubt Jeff began this project long before the 2020 election, but as he's already alluded to, this is a book that one reads now with constant flashes of January 6th, right? Especially the notorious presence of the Confederate flag inside the rotunda that day. If that didn't make sense to you already, as you read this book, it's just like pow, pow, pow. So very prescient, unfortunately, I have to say. Barbour County, home of George Wallace, the very avatar of anti-federalism and the preservation of white supremacy, has some striking features. Like much of this swath of the Deep South, what Jeff calls the Black Belt, although if you read his book closely, it's a little more complicated than that. The county's history has been defined both by a persistent commitment to white supremacy, marked by a series of violent upheavals driven by the refusal of first Indigenous and then African-American residents of the county or the region to submit to that supremacy. Naked land dispossession in defiance of federal treaties opened up the frontier to white settlement, an economy briefly enriched by slavery in the antebellum period when half of the 24,000 inhabitants of Barbour County were defined as property, followed then by emancipation and a racial massacre that put paid to radical reconstruction that Jeff alluded to in 1874. And a few other things, 6 Alabama governors hailed from the county, not just George Wallace, not to mention a losing populist gubernatorial candidate, Reuben Cobb, who I would have liked to hear more about. There were also, by the way, I mean, Jeff talks about lynchings, but I'm not sure he gives the number. There were 8 lynchings during the peak lynching period of 1870 to 1950. 8 lynchings in this one county of 30,000 people. As Jeff said, textile workers during the 1930s did not join the general strike of 1934 and did not join the CIO, choosing instead the security of company paternalism instead. And of course, and you didn't really mention this or directly in your remarks, Jeff, but this was a place where there was absolute intransigence when it came to responding to Brown v. Board and to resisting school integration, not surprisingly, right? Here are a few other interesting facts about Barbour County. Between 1904 and 1944, with the single exception of 1928, thanks to anti-Catholicism, Democrats carried the county by 90% of the vote or more. I mean, this is a one-party state if there ever was one. In 1936, FDR won over 97% of the vote in this county. As Jeff suggests, perhaps he may have been wise to not support the 1935 anti-lynching bill. Then again, FDR did nearly as well, both in 1940 and 1944. So this is the solidest of the solid South. In 1948, however, Strom won 94% of the vote, and the Democrats won no votes because they were, not allowed on the ballot. And in 1964, there was that massive switchover as Barry Goldwater won 80% of the vote and LBJ won none, because again, the Democrats didn't even appear on the ballot, as far as I can tell. And of course, in 1968, Wallace won, only 71% of the vote. By the way, today, if you look, Trump won 53% of the vote. That is, the Democrat-Republican split mirrors the demographic division, white and black, almost exactly. As Jeff demonstrates, the only way the dominated could summon enough force in all the stretch of history to defend themselves against the onslaught, sometimes political, sometimes violent, sometimes both, was to call on the power of federal enforcement and or protection. But again, as you mentioned, Jeff, the feds have proved a fickle ally at best. In many ways, then, this remains a somewhat familiar narrative. The power of the book rests first in rooting that narrative in a single place in order to demonstrate the larger truth. Second, in telling some really, really compelling stories. I'm sure all of us can pick our favorites, if that's the right word, but the one that really stuck with me was that massacre in 1874 with a barrage of gunfire directed at the Reconstruction scalawag, the courageous Judge Elias Keels, which resulted actually in the death of a 16-year-old son and the end of Reconstruction in Alabama in 1874. Really a heartbreaking story, actually. And third, the other contribution here is presenting an explanatory framework for this relentless march under the tricolors of white supremacy, states' rights, and freedom. All right. It's that last one that I want to raise a few questions about, as Mia did, so that we'll actually have something to talk about. And because this is the most forcefully argued point, particularly with reference to Orlando Patterson, and I suppose in a similar way to Edward Morgan, extending that argument about slavery and freedom being joined at the hip into the 20th century. First, I found myself wondering about that old chestnut of American exceptionalism. Is this an exceptional story? It's probably no surprise to all of you after hearing the introduction that the other case I know is South Africa. There, white settlers pushed against a frontier inhabited by armed indigenous people. When they couldn't muster the military resources to defeat those people to take their land, they called on the metropolitan power for aid. Help was reluctantly given, but given nonetheless. Yet, once subjected to that metropolitan power, which politely suggested that maybe they should emancipate their slaves and bind them by labor by contract rather than force, the Boers, the predecessors to the Afrikaners, lit out for the territory and established independent republics in the name of Vryheid, freedom. We quit this colony under the full assurance that the English government has nothing more to require of us and will allow us to govern ourselves without interference in the future, wrote one of these frontiersmen around the same time that Alabamians were intruding on Creek territory, i.e. the 1830s. In fact, I looked this up, the Orange Free State, one of these independent republics set up in the 1850s, the coat of arms had the very word Vryheid, freedom in Dutch, Afrikaans, emblazoned upon it. Freedom was certainly the watchword of the Boers during the Second Anglo-Boer War as they tried to throw off what they claimed were the enslaving bonds of the British Empire, with much American admiration, it might be added. Yet, when their descendants acceded to power in 1948 and sought to impose apartheid on the nation of South Africa, the belief in local independence vanished rather quickly. This answers that question. Once in national power, Afrikaners sought to dictate local and provincial policy in matters of language, marriage, group areas, and much else besides, no exceptions allowed. And indeed, the apotheosis of Afrikaner freedom and apartheid was the declaration of a republic and the breaking away from the British Commonwealth in 1961. So while Jeff clearly doesn't believe that there was something in the water of the Chattahoochee River that led to this behavior on the part of the white barbarians, if I could call them that, from Indian removal to massive resistance, from Eli Shorter, these are some of the evil geniuses he talks about, to J.W. Comer, to George Wallace, and I have to give it to you, Jeff, My jaw dropped. I hadn't known that Mo Brooks, the infamous Mo Brooks of the body armor on January 6th, the guy who gave a tour to the people who were going to go in there with their murderous intent, was from Barbour County.
I have to intervene. I got to intervene on this. That is a mistake.
Oh no!
Yeah, the editor.
I called you on that. Okay.
So yeah, somebody put inserted in the editorial process from Barbour County instead of from Alabama, and I didn't catch it.
So where's he from?
He's from the northern
Oh,
Alabama,
well, this is
which actually doesn't quite make as much sense, really.
I'm going to get to that in a minute. then.
Okay.
So, but I wanted to ask you, were the white
Yeah.
West residents of Barbour County drinking from a uniquely poisoned well of American liberty, or is there something wider here? A second related question, and this really is the one that Mia's asking and that you addressed a bit, is the matter of worldview or political philosophy or authentic belief, whatever you want to call it. In short, was "Don't Tread on Me" a genuine political belief expressed in good faith, or rather, and I think, Mia, you were asking this exact question, simply a convenient rationalization or instrumentalization of the 10th Amendment? I ask because there seem to be more than a few instances in which first of all, those shouting states' rights from the rooftops do a volte-face and invite the intervention of federal power when the sturdy yeomen are not up to the task: Indian removal, rural electrification, crop subsidies, and I wrote this, but Mia said it, and a national abortion law. Right. Given this persistent willingness to embrace federal power when it suited their purposes, should we take states' rights as a language of freedom at face value, or should we regard it as Mia again asked, a language of expediency? All right. In several places, Jeff, you yourself allude to this paradox. You say, like many who fought against federal power, Eli Shorter was unrepentantly aggressive in pursuing it for his own purposes. This is in the 19th century. Or 130 pages and a century later, Southern nostrums of independence from federal power curdled in the heat of the Depression. We all know this. Or in the closing pages, even, you say those who proclaim anti-statism never hesitate to use the instruments of federal power for their own purposes. Wallace himself, it turns out, or at least this is my reading of your book, and you confirmed it in what you said, was nothing if not an unprincipled opportunist, an evil genius to be sure, but it wasn't a question of deep, authentic belief. It was the chase of power. You have that wonderful quote about if he were dropped into Albania, he'd be a communist almost immediately. Thinking of place, and I added this as you were talking, I mean, one interesting question is Frank Johnson. I mean, Frank Johnson is from Alabama too. And Frank Johnson, of course, becomes a believer in the Constitution and the use of federal power to protect rights nationally. Now, I know Frank Johnson was from the Hill Country, a virtually all white county, I think, right? Winston County up in the Northwest. So opposite side of the state, very different history in a way, but he's still from Alabama. And I hadn't known until you pointed this out that they went to law school together. So if we're looking for a specific question, I'd love to hear more about the contrast between Frank Johnson and George Wallace. Wallace preached states' rights and segregation because it was a winning formula in his time and place. Frank Johnson risked his life to stand up for federal power, not because it was expedient or it was the way to move forward, but because he believed it and because he was courageous, or so I would think. So I guess the question then is, does demagoguery equate to conviction? Can a philosophy of freedom really be wedded to vote chasing? This is sort of the Ron DeSantis question. So that's the second. So the first question I have is this specific to the United States? The second question is this a political philosophy or just a political formula, a belief rooted in the bones or a slogan? And again, the contrast to Frank Johnson seems pretty apt, I think. Finally, I would say there's the knotty question of Barbour County's own geographic, demographic, and yes, class divisions, not just the racial fault line. And here, I think place does matter because place was connected, it seems, to internal or potential internal rifts among whites. As Jeff shows us, it was only really the northern half of the county that was a classic black belt society defined by fertile, rich land, slavery, plantation agriculture, in-migration of enslaved people, subsequently after that, peonage, sharecropping, and so forth. The southern half, from, I think, where Wallace hailed, was defined mostly by poverty, white poverty as well as black poverty. So that returns us to another old chestnut. What's the matter with Alabama? Does racial hatred, ably manipulated by a grasping elite, turn poor whites against their own so-called interests, substituting a counterfeit liberty? I think there are parts of the book that suggest that. Or is that, in fact, the immutable and genuine coin of the realm, racial hatred? So that's a question, I suppose. How does this fit into the what's the matter with Kansas question? But all in all, as you can see, a very, very thought-provoking book in all sorts of ways, and yeah, chillingly resonant today. I mean, today I was just reading before getting onto the computer, Dan Immerwahr's piece in the New Yorker about Timothy McVeigh and about David Koresh and about Waco, and I was like, damn, man, this is really more serious than I had thought about. And that made me begin to think, well, maybe it is a genuine belief system rather than simply political expedience. So I recommend that piece to anyone who's interested in these debates. So thank you again, Jeff,
Yeah,
and Mia.
Thanks for that, Alice. Yeah, this character Hardeman Owens is straight out of those guys, right? He tried to blow up the federal troops, and then when he was shot, he becomes by federal troops. He becomes a martyr to the entire state and becomes a rallying cry for the what we'd almost regard as right-wing militias today, right? So again, continuity there. Eric, I got lots to say, but I'm wondering if we should turn it over to other questions. I can try and fold answers into Alex's great points here, and some more that I haven't done.
Tell you what, why don't look at your watch, give a brief response or two to one or two of Alex's points.
Okay.
We got a number of people with their hands up, and then I will turn to them and we will proceed apace.
And if you're going to pick one, I really would love to hear more about Frank Johnson, I think, and the contrast between Johnson and Wallace.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll just really fast. I think the American Exceptionalism one is really interesting. And thank you for both connecting this to Capital Moves, but also especially Edmund S. Morgan, because I really saw this as the continuation of that story in a lot of ways, in my wildest dreams. Which raised the question of American exceptionalism. The problem with American exceptionalism is the way we think about it, at least in the labor history world, is sort of, do class relations evolve differently than Europe, right? But you've got the right framework. It's more about these settler colonial settings, and I think throw that question out. But what's the pool? What's the comparative pool? And if we're beginning to talk about Brazil, South Africa, and the United States, that might be a more interesting thing than, the Katznelsian, France, England, US kind of thing. And I think that makes for a richer kind of set of questions around, especially for the Deep South. As we know, American exceptionalism just drives everybody crazy. And it has nothing to do, obviously, with the city on a hill perceived greatness of America in terms of that version of American exceptionalism. Philosophy versus slogan. I think it is a kind of swamp of expediency, right? But it is built upon a foundation that goes all the way back to Athenian democracy, which was the birthplace of freedom, which was also a slave society, and freedom was defined as not being enslaved. And so when the founding fathers, try to build this republic, they're looking to Athenian democracy. But it's also in a settler colonial situation. It's also in chattel slavery. And so that version, I think, really that version of freedom really metastasized ideologically, becomes much more aggressive than it might otherwise have been, say in Massachusetts or something, and which had its own problems. But I think it can be both, right? You have an existing ideological framework that can go a variety of ways, but if you can leverage that, I mean, the references to Jefferson are just never stop, ever. They are everybody's trying to recreate the Jeffersonian ideal here, and it's almost, as somebody named after Jefferson. It can be nauseating, but yeah, I was going to mention the Albanian quote too. That if you dropped Wallace into the Albanian countryside, he would be in the Comintern in a number of years. That if this is the ideological terrain on which power is taking place, that's the ideology you're going to mobilize, right? And then the Frank Johnson thing. What a guy! I mean, that guy's really amazing. There's actually, some books that put these two characters together, these two opposite of the state, so he was this Republican appointed judge who basically did the right thing in all the civil rights cases in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Fred Gray, Rosa Parks' attorney, SCLC's attorney, argued in front of him regularly, and he did his best. And I think he just believed in his bones that in democracy, and that this was the right thing to do. But I think choosing one data point doesn't necessarily kind of, this one judge who does the right thing. Imagine the world without him, though. It's horrifying, right? And it does speak to the power, it's like Elias Keels. Where'd that guy come from? He's the scalawag judge who sides with the freedmen. Some of these characters just have principles above power, and above history, above, that they sort of stand above this stuff. And I am really impressed by those characters. And I think in some ways Keels and Johnson are very, very similar in that regard. And even like Comer early on, not JW, but Donald Comer, the textile mill guy, he's an early New Dealer. He's like, this could work out. I believe in the right thing for my workers, until it crosses the line, and then he turns against the New Deal, the second New Deal. He won't buy into. So there's sort of a cast of characters who sort of believe in law or benevolence or paternalism or rights, or a variety of things that I think to see this as a story of ideological lockstep would be completely uninteresting, would be preposterous.
All right, thank you. Let's open this up. If you wish to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function. You get to ask it, or the Q&A function, which I get to ask it using your words. But we have a couple of people already in the queue. Thomas Timberg is up first, and Robert Harris follows. Thomas, if you would unmute yourself, join the conversation.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. The first thing is an extremely stimulating book, which I now have to get to and read, particularly the fourth section, because a focus that actually Professor Lichtenstein created was some of the specifics of Alabama. Incidentally, I hadn't known that Johnson came from Winston County. Anybody who knows Alabama knows Winston County is a unique phenomenon. It sided with the Union during the Civil War and continued to vote Republican throughout the peninsula. Has almost no non-whites in it, and that may affect things. However, it's not quite true, incidentally. It is politically, in some ways, part of the Black Belt, and shares with them the fact that since the Civil Rights Movement, by and large, though I'm sure there are attempts to restrain it, African Americans have been voting. They have, in fact, had some effect on getting some services and so forth. But in this county, unlike a lot of the other Black Belt counties, their number is somewhat lower, as Professor Lichtenstein pointed out. They have not won any of the county things. However, the county is exceptional in one respect, which I don't know if you know about, which is its Democratic Party still has significant white participation.
Trump won it by 90%, though, I will say.
What?
Trump won it by 90.
That's Trump. But if you look on the web, when this issue came up, I looked on the website. their Facebook page, it's mostly white pictures. They have some of this has to do with seniority in the Alabama legislature, frankly, which is the older generation often kept their Democratic affiliation because under Alabama laws, you lose your seniority when you change your party. But in any case, I wondered if you know anything about this phenomenon. And in particular, the one thing is you said, actually, the vote for Trump, as you said, was 53%, but the white population is actually now slightly lower than the African-American population. And I suspect that the vote may reflect the fact that the white population may also be older and vote more, though marginally, and that may be the case. But I wondered if you know anything about these politically, well, if you will, the exceptional things, both the close balance of races, the fact that the Democrats, that the whites continue to dominate politics, and obviously the fact that the Democratic Party, and it's almost unique in Alabama these days, has significant white participation.
Jeff?
Yeah, I don't. I'm not able to add a lot of detail to that question. Essentially, I mean, for all intents and purposes, my study ends in the 1970s, as does any sort of economic dynamism, either from agriculture or textiles. It's now essentially a tourist destination, fishing and pilgrimage to these amazing faux antebellum mansions. I say faux just because most of them were built in the 20th century. So I kind of end there, and I did not do a detailed analysis of kind of post 70s and 80s politics. But I don't know anybody who's read the book and wanted more. So it's lengthy.
416 pages.
Of text.
Text. Immensely readable. Okay. Robert Harris is next, and if Leon Fink can be on standby, you can follow. If you could unmute.
Fine. Okay, here, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, very good. I'm wondering why, Jeff, you were reluctant to use the term white supremacy. Alex, in his comments, used it several times. And I'm wondering if you also might consider the concept of Herrenvolk democracy, which Alex might speak to as well.
Yeah, I think, sorry, are you finished?
Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah. No, great questions. Herrenvolk democracy, I think this is, in fact, honestly, Herrenvolk democracy in operation in a lot of ways. Again, hesitant to, as I was trying to sort of circumscribe my story to one county, I also wanted to contain the ideas and language to that too. This is, I to be pretentious, I regarded this as sort of a writerly project, and I really tried hard on the writing, and I didn't want to intervene with these ahistorical terms or a national, I don't know, like from other places. And so I didn't. White supremacy I do use when it's used, and of course it rises in this period after redemption, especially around the turn of the 20th century. Then we see it take off, and it is a politics of white supremacy. They make that specific claim, and when they are making that specific claim, and they do in no uncertain terms, and with the 1901 Constitution, then I use it a lot. But I was trying to use actors' categories, not social scientific categories. That's the only reason. And I think in some ways we do a little disservice not with the term white supremacy, because I think it's, well, like whiteness and I think some of these terms are I make sure my grad students explain what they're saying when they use these terms, because they can just go, oh, that's whiteness. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? How does that operationalize? Who's ideologically white? Who's, you know, who's white and pigmented, and, you know, like what's going on here? And it just demands greater precision, I think.
Thank you. Leon Fink, unmute. You know the routine.
I don't know. I've been trying to mute Leon Fink since I was a grad student.
Absolutely. But yeah, but Jeff, I'm actually one of those who wants more, and even though you don't, in this sense that it seems like your argument is pretty airtight, or certainly compelling, through the Wallace era, where the white freedom seems to carry effectively the load of the argument. But you also, at least your comments here, and I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but I gathered that you do make a jump. You say, January 6th, the Trump era. I want you to just for the moment, maybe just comment on whether you think that works for the more recent period, which you think of Trump as really elected on an anti-immigrant platform, as well as a platform about runaway shops and runaway industry, which actually ties into capital moves, your own, which were actually your concerns in an earlier book. So I just wonder whether this racial dynamic that you've fixed on here works for the subsequent period. And especially, how do you compare the anti-immigrant dynamic to the racial dynamic of the earlier period?
Yeah, that's great. And for those of you playing at home, Leon Fink was my advisor, for which I am eternally grateful. So good questions. And I think this ties a little bit to the question about whether the Native American story connects to the African American story. And I think a lot of scholars of indigenous history have come out and said, thank me for connecting it to black-white relations, that there's some continuity there. And I think there is with anti-immigration sentiment as well. So I think the themes, maybe there's a whole fifth, I guess, section where I could tell a national story that is sort of shockingly nationalist, I think, in a lot of ways, in the Trump era, around jobs and all that. But what you see in this sort of anti-statism, and I see this when I go in the Midwest and talk about trade and stuff like that, is they blame the government for trade. Like that it's the NAFTA was a creation of the Clinton Democrats, which it partially was. It was passed by Bill Clinton. And therefore, that's the type of federal action we can't have. The federal government is subsidizing trade. The federal government is doing this and that. And there are elements of it's true, but it's ultimately not, I think, the central story. So the mobilizing of race and mobilizing of anti-statism or anti-federal power, more precisely, I think continues well into the Trump thing, but and especially in this kind of virulent kind of love my country, hate my government sentiment. But again, I think maybe the county concept was too limiting, because not that much. There's some race stuff that happens in the 80s where these two brothers are killed by cops. These two black brothers are killed by cops that I cut from the manuscript. But the place kind of falls asleep. It goes from being one of the most dynamic places in the state to kind of being a sleepy backwater. And so the story of the place kind of peters out a little bit.
Thank you. I'm going to exercise my prerogative to get in a question or so here. And I'm in part repeating what Mia and Alex have posed, but I'm just want to come at it one more time. And I'm wondering if, in reading this book, we might think of it as kind of situational anti-statism. It's useful in some moments,
Mhm.
not useful in
Mhm,
others.
mhm. Yeah.
And freedom itself is a concept that is rather broad, and depending on who wants to use it, you can fill it up with different definitions.
Absolutely.
It resonates, but it means different things to different people, or at least they can express it in different ways. So you've talked about, the white Southerners were quite happy with federal power when it came in the form of, subsidies for agriculture, New Deal programs, rural electrification. Who's objecting to military bases that are being built? Or one could extend it to today. Every time there's a hurricane, and there are a lot of hurricanes, these southern states welcome vast quantities of federal intervention and money to undo, to take care of the damage. So is it statism or anti-statism, or, at the risk of being a reductionist, is it really about race? So at the end of the day, upholding whatever you want to call it, the white way of life, white supremacy, fill in the blank, when the federal government uses this power to undermine the segregationist order, it's evil. And when it does other things that doesn't, it's not evil. And so it becomes politically convenient to invoke this situational anti-statism for political means. But is it really hostility to the state? Is it really about preserving freedom? Because many of these Southern voters over the course of this period don't seem to object to local or state level oppression. They're not complaining about their freedoms being taken away by their governor or their mayor. Elections are stolen left and right. You have these vivid examples of political corruption where you could imagine people rising up and saying, but our freedoms are being taken away, but they don't. So situational categories.
Yeah, great. I don't think that's too far from what I was trying to say. And I think clearly, I think I failed to state what I thought was the obvious enough. And the obvious to me is, more often than not, political power works for white people. What happens when it doesn't? Right. That becomes the fly in the ointment. So even corruption, if the stealing of 3 elections under the populists, that was an attempt to, a naked class power grab against the popular classes, right? By the big mules, the industrialists, and the planters. But how do they win it? Yeah, through race, right? They disenfranchised black people, split this is the old C. Vann Woodward argument. And split the coalition, but white people got disenfranchised in the process too. So, is this just race? I mean, yeah, it's just race. But what is the ideological tools available to express race, and how do they connect with the founding ideals? And this is what I really want to get at, is that the founding ideals are mobilized for some of the most pernicious concepts, and maybe they are pernicious to begin with in their very origin. And so, yeah, I think the anti-statism is clearly selective beyond a shadow of a doubt. I think, good Lord. But the idea that, I guess, part of my project is to expose the use of freedom on the right, and to challenge the left to come up with maybe some better ways of thinking about freedom, or not even using freedom, because it's, as you say, it's so capacious, it's so wide open, it's so elastic, that you can pour whatever meaning you want into it. Now, maybe that could be politically powerful. You say, I'm the Freedom Party, and everybody believes in freedom comes. But I think more often than not, what it's going to mean is that the Freedom Party is going to be a highly racialized thing, and that it's going to win its victories against the conspiracy going all the way back to Balin, right? Colonists saw a conspiracy against their common good, and they asserted freedom against tyranny. So I'm with you sort of halfway on that. But the other half is I think we really have to we can't just dismiss the ubiquitous, continuous evocation of this term.
All right. Unfortunately, I have to draw this to a close. We could probably stay on here for another couple of hours easily. We've only scratched the surface of this book, as you might have inferred, and as our discussants have noted, there's a lot more in terms of stories and themes in these pages. But I want to express my thanks to Jeff, Mia, and Alex, and to those of you in the audience. For those of you who just can't get enough of history programming, we've got something for you. 2 sessions coming up over the course of this next week. For example, tomorrow, Tuesday, May 2nd at 4 p.m., join us for a discussion of Cold War liberation, the Soviet Union, and the collapse of the Portuguese Empire in Africa with Natalia Telepneva. And next Monday, on the May 8th, you could join us for Georgetown University's Joseph Sassoon's new book, The Sassoons, The Great Global Merchants and the Making of Empire. And let me add that in 2 weeks, on May 15th, we feature Chad Williams and his new book, The Wounded World, W.E.B. Du Bois and the First World War. So please come back, join us. We welcome you. Thanks for joining us tonight, and I hope you can join us in the weeks ahead. Thank you. Good night.